Now, just 3 weeks from next Tuesday, Donald Trump will ascend to become the next president of the United States for what will be his second term, interrupted by one Biden term. And of course, the question on nearly everybody's mind, certainly in the Europe and in Russia and in Ukraine, is what is going to happen to that war when Donald Trump comes in? All the pieces are being set up right now for negotiation, and it's not really, frankly, about what anybody in Europe are saying. It's not about what Volodymyr Zelensky is saying. It's about what Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are saying. And those are the two voices that are going to matter the most when it comes to negotiating. And so we have been seeing a jockeying of position. A lot of probably things have been going on behind the scenes. We've heard evidence that is going on, but there's also comments going on in front of the scenes in public. Trump has made some comments. Some of his lieutenants have made some comments. And here recently, Putin himself and some of his lieutenants have also been making some comments. So we're starting to get a little bit more information now. And one of the things we love to do on Daniel Davis Deep Dive is to give you context and to give you, here's what both sides are saying, as opposed to demonizing one side and just saying, yay, yay, rah, rah, cheerleader on whoever our side happens to be. Because that gives you a skewed understanding of reality. And there's too much of that going on already. So we're going to lay out some of the comments that some of these leaders and some of their what's going to be subordinates, especially for the Trump administration when he takes over on January 20th, to see if we can figure out how these negotiations are actually going to go. Now, we want to start off, and we're going to look at Trump versus Putin primarily, but we're going to see what some of their other folks say as well to get a good glimpse. So let's start with Trump. Now, you may remember as far back as just last, I think it was June, in the first debate between then candidate Biden and candidate Trump, when he came on and it was asked specifically about what would you do in response to the Russia-Ukraine war.
The money that we're spending on this war, and we shouldn't be spending, it should have never happened. I will have that war settled between Putin and Zelensky as president-elect before I take office on January 20th. I'll have that war settled.
Okay, well, we're just over 3 weeks out, and I haven't seen it settled yet. So maybe that was a little bit of a hyperbole. Obviously, everyone knew at the time that it wasn't literally going to be solved. At least I think it is. I don't know. I never exclude the possibility that maybe Trump thought that he would have it negotiated. Maybe he thought he could give a notice to Zelensky, even unofficially, and maybe send some couriers to Putin. Perhaps he could say, hey, maybe if we'll just get the broad outlines of something and have it resolved even before I get in there. I don't know what he actually meant by that, but we do know now, since we're nearly on that date, that certainly didn't happen. And we also have, in recent days where Trump went on to acknowledge that, okay, it's a little more difficult than I thought.
I think the Middle East will be in a good place. I think actually more difficult is going to be the Russia-Ukraine situation. I see that as more difficult. When you say there will be I don't think they should have allowed missiles to be shot 200 miles into Russia. I think that was a bad thing. And that brought the Koreans in, North Korea, another man I get along with very well. I'm the only one that does.
Okay, now, to be fair, that issue he mentioned there at the last part of that clip that, well, I was against the use of long-range weapons. So after Trump won the election on a platform to end the war by negotiations, then you had President Biden, after spending the better part of 3 years denying the Ukraine side the ability to use long-range weapons, then he suddenly changed his mind and gave that permission. So that kind of gummed up the works a little bit, or made it more complicated, because we only know what the Russian side, and whether it's Putin or any of his spokesmen, have said in public. We've seen what they have done. It's unclear actually whether that has actually changed any of the dynamics in terms of an end of war negotiations, or whether or how the thing is going to come to pass. But without question, I think Trump is starting to see that this is going to be a lot more difficult than he thought, because you have so many different players involved. Now, I've shown images on this show here many times in recent last couple of 2 or 3 weeks, where you've got Keir Starmer, who just curiously still talks about Ukraine winning. You've had Manuel Macron talk about maybe we'll put some troops into Western Ukraine, possibly peacekeepers, et cetera. So that's kind of muddying the waters there, because then the question is, well, is there a unified Western side? And what is the view? And obviously, self-evidently, the answer is no. There is no consensus. And then, as you're going to see here momentarily, you've got the Zelensky side, and he's still fighting on and shows no interest in having a negotiated settlement, although kinda. That's part of the problem too, because even on the Ukrainian side, you have the president who has imperceptibly but dramatically shifted from his previous rhetoric that we are going to win everything. We are going to drive Russia out. We are not going to settle for anything less than the full restoration of the 1991 borders, which includes Crimea and the Donbass. Now, that was always just a fantasy that was never, ever going to happen. There's so many very practical, fundamental reasons why it wasn't. But that was his position. He kept going. Then he kind of shifted like, one level over, and this is several months ago, where he said, okay, well, I'm going to negotiate. We're going to settle this diplomatically, but I'm not going to give up any territory, which in certain respects is even more out of touch with reality, because how are you going to reach a negotiated settlement and not give up any territory? That would imply that you somehow have some way to convince Vladimir Putin that even though he has conquered about a fifth of your country and has it already annexed into his country and by their own views considered as part of Russian territory, that somehow you couldn't force it out of his hands militarily, but diplomatically you're going to convince him to just hand it over to you. That was always the weird part. And then now it's kind of shifted into a third direction where he says, okay, well, there will have to be a negotiated settlement. We'll just get back our land later on with diplomacy. So in making it very clear that he now in this late hour understands he's going to have to give up some territory. And so all of this is going on. So you have this mishmash of various comments going on by Western officials and leaders saying one thing, and then Trump kind of trying to find out where he's going. Now, one of the notes that we had, or one of the pieces of evidence about where Trump's mind is, came from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Fox News just yesterday, actually, where he kind of laid out what Trump is going to have to do if he wants to win the negotiations.
The problem set in Europe fundamentally happened directly because of the absence of American leadership and American deterrence. Actually, in the same way that what happened on October 7th was a failure of American leadership. Right. What we saw yesterday, these Christmas Day attacks, were serious. President Trump understands this. He's been talking about a conversation with Vladimir Putin that will inevitably have to happen. You have to convince Vladimir Putin that the cost of continuing this conflict exceeds the benefit. And when you don't do that, you get innocents killed all across Ukraine for now over 2 years, coming on 3. Okay. American leadership is important. That will mean leading the Europeans to do what it is they need to do. This is in their backyard. This is a European conflict. President Trump understands that, and we did it for 4 years. We had kept Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine when President Obama couldn't do that, and President Biden clearly didn't either. I'm convinced President Trump and his team can build back a model which will protect America, protect Europe, and make the world more peaceful and stronger as we move into 2025.
Okay, so let me kind of parse through a lot of that, because it's hard to really understand what Pompeo said, because he just has this autopilot thing anytime a camera goes on and there's a microphone in front of his face, where he first of all has to denigrate the current administration. It's just like whatever you're asking. You could have asked him to say, what do you think about the fact that it was cloudy when the sun came up this morning? He would somehow say, well, if it wasn't for the current administration, the Democrats, so just ignore all that part, because that's just a bunch of just standard blather nonsense. Doesn't mean anything at all, because there were certainly many things about this war that were set the stage during especially the latter part of the Trump administration. Don't need to go through all that right now. That's not important. What is important, though, is where his mind is. And this is part concerning. There's a couple things I want to point out here. First of all, he says that Trump has to convince Putin that the cost-benefit ratio is not in Putin's favor to keep fighting the war. Now, how do you suppose he's going to do that? Because when you look at the conduct of the battle, you can start off in the Kursk area in the north, kind of the northwest a little bit. Then you can move over to the Kharkiv area, which is still an active front. Doesn't get much notice because the lines haven't moved, but there are people being killed and killing on that side of the line every single day. So there's still conflict going on there, and the Russians are still on Ukrainian territory in that area. And then, of course, from Kupiansk all the way down to Zaporizhia, down to the Dnipro River, et cetera, where that intersects down there, and all along the Pokrovsk, all those other little towns and villages, Karakovo we've been talking about, Vilkanova Selica, et cetera. All of those things are continuing to go in Russia's favor, as they have for this entire calendar year, really going back to November of last year. It's been going forward. And as we frequently show you graphically, that the pace has been picking up, that the Russians are killing more Ukrainian people. They're taking more Ukrainian territory at a faster rate. And as I've shown you on recent times, I've shown the map, the defensive fortifications in these areas are among the last that Ukraine has. So it's clear that you can't keep this pace up for a lot longer, even if the Ukraine army doesn't crack or fall, as we know is an ever-present possibility. So that's the on-the-ground reality. What then can Trump bring into this that can convince Putin that the cost-benefit ratio is not in his favor to continue the war? Because as it certainly appears at face value, the cost benefit is very much in Putin's favor if he wanted to continue on with this war. Because if the negotiations drag out, if whatever Trump puts on the table, and by the way, he's been pretty good at keeping those cards close to the vest. So he has not much talked about what kind of plan he may have, and I'm sure that that's by design because he wants to keep those possibilities open for negotiation. And he doesn't want to tip his hand too early. Why would you want to do that? But there have been some things that have come out. We'll talk about that in a second. But the things that we can see is that if Trump, whatever these cards are he wants to play, doesn't work out well, and time starts going by, time is on Russia's side. The Ukraine side can't just keep going on with the status quo, which is Russian advances. The status quo is not a frozen conflict. The status quo is a Russian advance. And you can see that Putin doesn't have to be in a hurry. He can take his time and say, you can either negotiate to the standards that I've set out here, or we'll just keep going. And then we know whatever happens on the battlefield happens on the battlefield. Of course, what that has the prospect of doing, or the result of doing, is that every month that would pass thereafter takes cards out of Trump's hands. So then his negotiating position gets weaker over time. So that's why my general argument is that when Trump gets into office on January 20th, his negotiating position will be the strongest it's going to be. Every month of delay after that, his position gets weaker and his leverage in negotiations gets smaller, because you have to understand that from the Russian perspective, if Russian military keeps moving to the West, where's their negotiation, or where's their motivation to stop that if they're not getting what they want in negotiations? So as I've kind of been warning to you about many times since the election has happened, is that Trump is going to have a difficult time ending this on anything that looks good to the Western people. We'll see how that works out there and see what his folks are telling him behind the scenes. The second thing from that last comment from Pompeo I want to point out, though, may give an indication of where Trump wants to go. And that is, he highlighted the issue that this is a European issue. So Trump may be setting up to say, hey, we're going to start diminishing how much stuff that we're providing here. And you Europeans who are going to be living with the result of this are going to have to start stepping up. Instead of being in the shadows, you're going to have to move up into the sunlight, and you're going to have to move up into the first place. And Trump may be saying, we're going to start moving further back. You're going to start moving further up, and to take a bigger share of the burden of responsibilities. And then we'll see firsthand whether they want to continue spending the money, whether they want to continue degrading their own military capacity by getting rid of long-range weapon systems, interceptor missiles, which Zelensky still this past week continues to ask for. I think 19 systems. Nobody's given them because no one wants to give up something. Just imagine if you are privately convinced, as the evidence shows, as we show, that the war is already over. It's already, the result is already determined. It's period. It's end. All you can do is just find out how the final negotiations are going to come out. Why would you want to take one of your precious air defense when this war has shown how critical it is to have good air defense systems? Why would you want to give that into what will almost certainly be putting it into the garbage heap? And it will just go into a black hole and be destroyed, or just rot on a battlefield someday and rust out into oblivion. That's why no one's giving them, because they recognize that. That's a big tell. I assure you that's not missed on the Russian side. So Trump could be setting up to go in that direction. Now, the Europeans themselves are going to have to figure some things out here, because as recently as October, the new Secretary General Mark Rutte emphatically said this.
Yes, in the future, NATO will have, as a 32 or 34th member, we will have Ukraine. At the moment, it seems that it will be Ukraine as number 33, but maybe somebody else pops in front of him. But Ukraine will be a member of NATO in the future. That is what we decided in Washington.
That's he was referring to the Washington summit, the 75th anniversary of NATO here in Washington, D.C. this past summer. To great fanfare, they again emphatically said that it is for sure, it's inevitable, I think was the term that they used, that Ukraine will be in NATO, of course, which gave all the motivation and incentive to the Russian side to say, okay, that's why we went to war, so that's why we'll keep fighting the war, making it worse for the Ukraine side. Now, that was on the 17th of October, so obviously about 2 weeks later, a little over 2 weeks later, the U.S. election happened, which put Donald Trump in. Now, we have not heard Rutte say emphatically that they will be in NATO after that time, but now what he's kind of saying is some code words, some slightly different. He said, well, there'll be security guarantees. We'll help secure Ukraine's future, et cetera. And we want to continue supporting them. And I think we showed you within the last week, there was a meeting in Brussels 2 or 3 days ago, I think it was, with Mark Rutte and with Zelensky. And, he's got this big old smile on his face, and he's, glad handed, slapping him on the back, putting his arm around him. And I'm just thinking, who is fooled by this kind of stuff? And why are you doing that? Because you're telling him you're going to continue supporting militarily. You're going to continue giving him things. But everybody knows NATO is off the table. It was never on the table, to be truthful. Some people may have wanted it in a handful, but those who know would never, ever, ever have brought Ukraine into NATO, knowing that they're unstable and that there's constant friction between the two. Nobody in their right mind is going to say, I'm going to put the security of my nation in your hands and hope that something bad doesn't happen between two people who have enmity on a hot border. So that wasn't going to happen even before February 2022, even though a lot of the words coming out of their mouth said so. Privately, leaders, a number of them, wouldn't do it. And of course, now it's not so private, especially with Robert Fico of Slovakia and Viktor Orban of Hungary are overtly saying it ain't never going to happen. In fact, they're both emphatically now, they have both Fico and Orban have personally gone to Moscow to try and see if we can find some kind of a negotiated deal and to try and lay the foundation for that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But what hasn't changed, though, is that Russia will not, under any circumstances, now or later, contemplate any role for NATO. And so we had actually the Kellogg plan has been talked about a number of times. Okay, I tell you what, if that's such a sensitive issue, how's about we push that off for like a decade? Just kind of, later on, we'll figure that out. And then we'll have a negotiated settlement in the meantime. So this is one of the other things that Trump's primary negotiating person, his Russia-Ukraine czar, General Kellogg, said this.
He recommended that the U.S. begin a formal policy to seek a ceasefire and negotiated settlement. Under that plan, if Kyiv agreed to enter talks with Russia, the U.S. would continue to arm Ukraine. To persuade Russia to participate in the negotiations, Kellogg suggested delaying Ukraine's membership in NATO in exchange for security guarantees.
But will the Russians consider doing that? So we've talked a whole lot so far about what Trump and some of his guys have been saying. This is what we're trying to negotiate. This is kind of where we want to do it. I think probably in reality, I doubt Kellogg or Trump actually think that they're going to be let in 10 years. I don't think they believe that, actually. My opinion is that they're just saying that to placate some people on the West and just say, we'll push this off to the table. Problem is that Putin is not willing to do that. In fact, at a press conference earlier today, literally just hours before we making this video here, he was asked that very question about the claims by the incoming Trump team that they want to seek a delayed NATO invitation. Here's what he said.
I don't know what they are saying right now in the new upcoming team of the next American president, but in 2021, President Biden back then proposed exactly that. He said that they would postpone the ascension of Ukraine to NATO for the next 10 years because it was not ready. And I responded, yes, it wasn't ready. But what you will do is you will prepare it and then make it part of NATO. So it's actually not that long of a period. For us, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 year or 10 years. In historical terms, that's not so much.
See, now his answer there shows one of the biggest differences in negotiating between the Russian side and the Western side in general, and Trump in particular. Trump is more transactional. He's worried about what can we get done today. I think that's why he's saying, yeah, we'll put the NATO thing off for a decade, meaning way after I'm out of power. I won't even be around in this. And so it'll certainly never happen on my watch, but we'll just put that off to another day. I'm just thinking about getting the war done right now. Whereas Russia is saying, no, we're thinking in long terms. We're thinking of chunks of time, decades of time moving forward. And so they say, what good does it do to, quote, put that off when we'll be just as adamantly opposed to it now as we are later? And then that's when you get into what is his position. Now, we've talked about this a few times. On June 14th, he laid this out. I'm going to put it up on the map here. What he has said is the all Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and the Kherson provinces that they annexed back in 2022 and now claim as Russian territory. But as we pointed out here, these red areas, that's what Russia currently owns and currently possesses. That's where their occupation forces are. These grayed in areas here, these are the rest of those territories. There's bits of all four of them that are still under Ukraine control. And he's saying this is our minimum negotiating position. And as I think we've mentioned before, there's many in Russia that say that that's not enough, that all the price that they pay, that they want more. They want Kharkiv up here. They want Odessa down here. And whether or not they can get it is a separate issue. But that is what many on the Russian side wanted to believe that with enough time they could get. So the question is going to be, is the West even willing to negotiate here? Here's the problem, or one of the many problems for the Ukraine side, is if whether it's Zelensky or Trump or any of the other Western allies, if they're not willing to make a deal to give Putin the part that in these areas that he's asking for, it's not unreasonable to think that he may be just willing to say, yeah, you know what, we're just going to keep fighting. We'll just continue on. And we saw part of that when we talked yesterday about some of the things of Lavrov. Please go and watch that video in its full, where he kind of mentioned, we're willing to negotiate, but if our conditions aren't met, we'll continue on where what we've been doing, which is this methodical move to the West, where they're going to take this territory. So it's going to be really, really hard for Trump to actually negotiate away that part. Now, his job, Trump, is going to be even more difficult because of Volodymyr Zelensky, because he right now, and I told you a minute ago how he's kind of been all over the map and changing things around, but still really boisterous. Well, one of his latest comments is that he's just going to keep fighting. He's not even talking about giving up anything.
Ми обов'язково продовжимо завдавати ударів по російських військових об'єктах дронами і ракетами, і все більше українськими по саме тим військовим базам, по саме тій російській воєнній інфраструктурі, яка використовується в такому терорі проти наших людей. Наш захист абсолютно справедливий.
Now, those are big words that you can say from inside your presidential residence there, from the relative security of Kiev. But out on those front lines, that's having things are not working out that way. And as I mentioned a minute ago and have been talking for a while, my concern, and really this is going back months, has been that at some unknown point, the fabric of the Ukrainian army could just tear and break finally, just collapse. And then the whole thing could just come tumbling down in a moment. We've seen it happen many times in history, and you just never know where it could come in. I projected at the beginning, like late spring, that I thought it could happen by the end of the summer. It didn't. They continued to hang on. But that thread, folks, is getting ever more thin. There's a piece in the Washington Post that came out yesterday, which talks about some of those very issues right there. And the Washington Post interviewed a bunch of guys in the Ukraine side, and they said, they're kind of hopeful that Trump coming in may end the war. But then when you spin on down here, you see that there's some real problems here. And as I've said so many times until I'm blue in the face, that it's not about men. Warfare is not just about money and machines, but about the men. And if you don't have the troops, and that means trained troops in sufficient numbers and sufficient types of capabilities and training at the various levels to have an effective fighting force, it's not going to matter how much money you want to throw at this issue. It's not going to matter how much your president makes videos and rails at the opponent. And one of the things you see in this Washington Post piece here, I just want to read just a little bit of it because this validates exactly what we're talking about and illustrates the growing danger to the Ukraine side. It said, but most Ukrainian military personnel acknowledge that soldier shortage are now just as critical as weapon deficits. Some specialized jobs in the 33rd Brigade, such as a driver for armored personnel carriers, were down to just one person in a battalion, soldiers said, complicating logistics. You can't even get what limited stuff you have because you don't have the personnel to move it. And then it goes on down further. It says, do we even have infantry, said 37-year-old Dennis, a drone operator. It's down to a couple of guys, and they're over 50 years old. What are they going to do? Felix, 39, who was responsible for providing logistics and moral support for his unit, said fighters simply exhausted. He hoped Trump's January inauguration would mark a turning point in the war towards negotiation because it could provide soldiers with a much-needed break. But then here, this last part is almost heartbreaking. It can't go on like this, Felix said. We're withdrawing, and they're pushing further and further. What kind of victory will happen? If officials can't put an end to it, maybe Mr. Trump can. Listen, folks, that needs to be sounded off all kinds of alarm bells in Kiev, because these are folks on the front lines in some of the key areas. And I assure you that's happening all over the place, not just in the one place that the Washington Post reporter was. We see evidence of that all over the place. And it makes sense. We've actually highlighted this too. Once Trump won, and it wasn't going to be just the status quo with, as long as it takes, that the Biden administration had been saying, and that Trump is already talking about negotiated settlement. We talked about this from a military perspective of the soldiers fighting in Ukraine. Where is your morale going to be? From where do you get the strength to keep fighting every single day when you know that the insufficient support that you've been getting is about to shrink and then probably dry up at some point? And you can see the men there saying, there's not enough of us. We're not getting enough stuff. And now that we can't even get it transported enough. And so all that results in continuing to fall back further and further to the west, as you saw on that map that I just mentioned a minute ago. If you can't even keep your guys fighting, then where is all this braggadocious commentary going to go to? And that is then compounded even more. So we've seen that's up to this point there that the Trump hand is small. Well, as Putin says, you have Zelensky saying he's going to keep fighting. So is that Vladimir Putin.
If we need to use it, we will. But it is no secret. We're taking our time. We don't have that many Arestovych systems. Yes, we do have them, but we're in no hurry to use it because this is a very strong, very powerful system used for specific purposes. We are still producing more and more of them. We will place some of them on the territory of Belarus, but we cannot rule out using Arestovych today, tomorrow, or at any time that we feel there's a need to use it.
So you see that they've already demonstrated this new Arestovych missile. It can't be shot down. The speeds are too high. Ukraine is not only able to shoot down some of the conventional cruise missiles, which are comparatively very slow missiles, and even those get through. There was a report out earlier today. I saw that the drone attacks from Russia into Ukraine have gone from 400 a month in May to 2,400 in the month of November. So it's obviously we don't have the numbers for this month here, but you see they continue to grow and get larger. So the defense industrial base continues to expand. It hasn't even peaked yet. So on top of all that I just showed you from the fighting man on the ground in Ukraine, the fighting on the ground in Russia continues to expand in their capability. There's also been some AI advances in how the Russians use these some of these the drones that they get from Iran. They have retrofitted that, and you basically use new technologies on top of that, retrofitted them to make them use IO, which makes them a lot harder to interfere with electronic warfare means, which Ukraine has done with a pretty good amount of success. But these, because there's more of them, is that whatever percentage you get through, the number are going to continue to rise, and we've seen that this week. And now that these more of these get through, because it's not you can jam the signal coming back, but if these things have AI capabilities where they have terrain mapping, etc., they don't have to have a signal anymore. They can just go onto the target and fly in there. And so that's making even more of them actually get through the countermeasures. And all of this keeps adding to the woes. And then with this Arestovych missile, whether there's a lot of them or a handful today doesn't matter, because they can hit any really high value target they want. I saw an earlier report today to where Russians are continuing to think about maybe it's time to start hitting strategic targets inside of Kiev. And that means senior officials like the Russian that was assassinated in Moscow, which, by the way, the Russians have not yet responded to. They said they would, they haven't. So that continues to be a real possibility as we get closer to it. But now we've talked a little bit about Trump, about Putin, but there's another potential evidence here of where Trump may be going here. It's too early to say how much of this is by design, but it's got our attention here, and we wanted to pass this along too. It didn't get a whole lot of coverage in the West, but we want to give it some here. In the PDB podcast, one of the more famous ones here in the United States. It's a really good show. They always have a lot of interesting people on their show. And one of them was Arestovych, who until a little bit of time ago, a number of months ago, was the key advisor for Zelensky. But now then, he's his chief opponent. In fact, he's not even in Ukraine anymore because he fears he would either be arrested or possibly even killed. Yet he's setting himself up as a potential campaign opponent of Zelensky if there is indeed a presidential election in 2025, which apparently the West is pushing them towards. If that is the case, one may be wondering if Arestovych himself is being set up as an alternative, because if it's no longer Zelensky making those kinds of comments, it could be a President Arestovych making these.
I believe we need to be a part of the collective West mentally, maybe perhaps not a very developed country. We still need to learn a lot of things, but we need to have a special relationship with Europe, NATO, United States, but we cannot join because at this stage, it means a third war with Russia, which we will not be able to bear.
So what makes you think the NATO and the West would want a candidate like you?
Yeah.
Why would they want somebody like you?
Because for us, the price of joining NATO is the war with Russia. And for NATO, the price of receiving Ukraine is the war with Russia.
But you remember what they did. I mean, think about what they did to Putin when Putin had all these NGOs of people being funded to protest outside. You know what they're going to do in your country if you go out there and you talk like this? You think they're going to let somebody like you win and saying you have no interest of being with NATO?
Yes, I think we will win. I will win.
So one has to wonder, where does his confidence come in? Because you saw the interview was very clear that said, hey, people who have had your view in Ukraine haven't fared very well. They have been driven out. Some of them have even been assassinated. And he's yet is very confident here. And one wonders, is that because privately, whether it's Trump team or any of these other European nations are telling him, hey, we'll support you if you become the next president of Ukraine, and you're talking something that makes any kind of sense at all. And you see he's radically different from a lot of the leaders in Ukraine, and a lot of the public opinion will also add in there that they want NATO membership because they think that they have believed, rightly or wrongly, that that's going to give them security for the future. Of course, you can take the emotion out of it, and it's clearly evident the answer is no, it won't. In fact, that's why there's war right now, and continue to try to cling on to that will ensure that the war continues. Now, Arestovych has belatedly come to the recognition that you got to get rid of that NATO thing so that you can get rid of the reason why Russia wants to go to war at all. If there's rational reason for Russia to think that NATO is now off the table so that a negotiation can come that says that there will be a nuclear-free, non-aligned Ukraine, then they said, along with the territorial submissions, that's also important, but along with those territorial submissions, then yes, they're willing to have a negotiated settlement. And in fact, there was an issue. We told you a little bit about it in, I think, yesterday's episode with Lavrov, talking about Fico from Slovakia, how he had gone to Moscow to talk to Putin. The primary cause there for the visit was because of a dispute between, weirdly, Kiev and Slovakia and Bratislava, where they said, hey, the transit fees are not working, and we still need cheap Russian gas, and we need to go through here. They've had a deal that the Ukraine side was benefiting from to the tune of $800 million a year. Crazy numbers there. And for some reason, Zelensky has now chosen, after, nearing the 3-year mark of the war, that he doesn't want to stop it. It's December 31st is when the deal ends. So Fico had gone to Russia to say, hey, can we work out some other kind of deal so we can still get the gas if it can't come through Ukraine, etc. Now, that was the purpose of why Fico was there. But as Putin said earlier today, he talked to him about issues about leading to the end of the war, and had this interesting observation and offer.
I don't know if Mr. Fico has any problems with the Ukrainian government or some officials in Europe. They need to reach their own understanding. But what he was speaking was primarily, of course, about the peace process in Ukraine, and this is what he wanted to see. So as to whether these talks could take place, he said, yes, if they do happen, his country is ready to provide a platform for a conversation like that. And we are certainly not against that if it comes to pass, because Slovakia is a neutral country. We believe it's a neutral country, it's a neutral position, and it's a very good choice for all of us.
So that's evidence there that Trump, that's why I've said at the beginning, he has a few cards. Trump is not an empty hand. He has some cards. Vladimir Putin does have motivation to see this come to an end through negotiations. If all he cared about was saying, hey, I can just take what I want on the battlefield and I don't care about negotiations. At some point, I'll just issue you a dictate that says, here are the terms of surrender. If like the Allies did during World War II for Nazi Germany, he could have done that. That's one path, but he's not doing that. He is still saying, even at this late hour, that yes, we want a negotiated settlement. We want to end the bloodshed. We want to, because they don't have some bloodlust that they want to kill Ukrainians. He also, and this is one of the biggest clarifications and certifying issues, that Russia doesn't just want to go and mow down the rest of Europe like so many in the West absurdly claim, to try to bring fear to their populations to make them support this losing operation. So that is being exposed. That Putin said, hey, we want to bring this to a just end that guarantees, like he said from the beginning, the security on our border. And so he's saying now here with Robert Fico, who of course he said they're neutral. They're not neutral. They're a member of NATO. They're a member of the European Union. So they aren't neutral, but he considers them as such because he thinks you want to end the war. So maybe this could be a neutral, relatively speaking, a neutral site from which to have negotiations. So potentially, there's been some talk already that possibly Russia and the United States, Putin and Trump, could meet possibly somewhere in the Middle East. That's been floated as one possibility. Or Putin said earlier today, possibly even Slovakia, because he wants this war to end. He also recognizes that that after this is over, that the world is going to have to move on. Putin recognizes that this is not an end unto itself. It's just an end of this phase. And then they had to get to the next one, which is everybody's going to learn how to live with each other. I mean, it happens after every war, and it's always complicated, and there's always lots of emotions and, feelings of betrayal and people who are really angry at the losses. And that's human things. And it always is present in a negotiated, and it definitely will be this one as well. But as his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said, I think just a couple of days ago, that there is a different world that's going to come out on the other side of this. There's a different world already that exists now, as opposed to what is still in the minds, frankly, of many of the Western people, thinking this is like early 1990s, to where the U.S. and the West could just dictate whatever they wanted to do. It didn't matter what anybody thought. No one else was powerful enough to stand up to it. Those days are no longer there. We still have a great deal of power. Let's be clear on this. No one's saying that we're suddenly weak. We're not as strong as some people ever thought we were, by the way. I'll add that in. We can talk about that more another day. But still, we have the most extraordinary economics, even with the rise of BRICS. It's not in competition yet with the West. The G7 and the United States, the economy is still the gorilla in the show here at the moment. But as Lavrov said, those things are changing.
So a multipolar world definitely would take for granted that the Western colleagues also participate without a doubt. But how can they position themselves, whether they will get through that psychological loss of domination that they enjoyed for half a century? All of that depends on their political culture and their real sound understanding of their place in this real life, and their ability to act accordingly, in accordance to their new situation.
And honestly, I mean, he was kind of riffing on that, but he's right. It's going to be hard for the West. It's always been hard. You look in history all the way back to the Peloponnesian War. When you have a declining empire and a rising empire, it's always really difficult to navigate those. And the reality is that many people call it an American empire, the Western way of world, the rules-based order, whatever title you want to put on it, it's still substantial. And here's the reality. So this is December 27th, 2024. As of today, the West can, if it takes wise courses of action, it can maintain its level of power and economic viability indefinitely into the future. It doesn't have to go on a collapse. Although I guess I have to put a caveat there. Some of the decisions and policies we've already used over the last few decades have put us in a very perilous position economically, and that could come crumbling down, but we'll deal with that separately. But in terms of natural resources, in terms of capacity, we can, even when that happens, because it's inevitable, we're going to have a dip, we can ride that out. If we end this war on the best terms we can get and understand it's going to be ugly for our side, ugly for Ukraine, but relatively speaking equitable, depending on what side you want to come down on. But it can be ended. And then we can start the process of rebuilding what's left of Ukraine. Russia will start rebuilding the portion on its side of the line. The people can stop dying. They can start trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives and to try to move on. Meanwhile, in the West, we can get back to possibly even reestablishing those pipelines, and then they can get cheaper gas from Russia, which Russia says they're still willing to do. That was one of the things Putin also talked about today. And so the European economy can start to do better because the cost of running the factories and whatnot can be lower. So that's something that they would like to do. Ending the possibility of any kind of additional war between NATO and Russia, ending the threat for the moment of any kind of nuclear escalation. All these things are great. These are all good for our side. And if we're just wise in how we go about this, we can get back onto that. And then the Trump administration can turn to all its domestic policies, whatever. A lot of people, there's just some people that will not be happy with any negotiated settlement, period, because all they wanted was everything back on the Ukraine side. That's not going to happen. And they'll complain and gripe and point fingers or whatever. Okay, that's going to happen. But then it'll go away. As long as we make a good deal, that ends the war, then they'll lose focus on it, and then they'll move on to whatever's next. It's just how human nature is. It's always worked that way. And we can do that. We can ride this thing out get through this bad situation without it having escalated, and then we can continue to live on and hopefully learn some lessons from that and start getting to the process of learning how we're all going to live together on this big rock called Earth again. And like I said, Russia ain't going anywhere. Europe's not going anywhere. U.S. isn't going anywhere. China's not going anywhere. All these people, we got to figure out how to work together. All that is possible as long as we recognize the ground truth reality and don't try to have a fantasy deal that tries to seek an outcome that's not possible to have. We can end this war, and early in 2025, something that I pray for so heartily is that the killing will stop, that the Ukraine men will no longer have to flee their country or die in a suicidal conflict, that their women can stop running, taking some of their young men out of their country for fear that the draft age is going to be lowered down to the upper teens, which is on the table right now to discuss. All those things can stop, and they can at least begin the very painful and very long process of healing. All those things can happen, and I certainly pray that they do. One last thing that I want to show you here, though, is when we're talking about negotiating and what's important. I mentioned at the outset that Trump is kind of transactional guy. That's his mentality. He's thinking short term, whereas Russia's thinking long term. There's one other aspect of the Russian side that we need to be aware of in Putin and his mentality. One of the questions that was asked of him was, do you think the conflict will be over in 2025? And his very short answer was, I believe in God, and God is with us. Anything else? And he moved on to the next question. That's as far as he took it. So you can say he doesn't mean that. You can say, well, that's, I think he's just using those terms or whatever. But it's clear if you've been tracking Putin from the beginning, yes, you can say he's a former KGB guy, and according to the West, he's got blood on his hands and all kinds of stuff. But here's the thing: it doesn't matter what we think. If he believes this, if Vladimir Putin believes that God's on his side, and he considers this war an existential issue for his country, it means, folks, that there is nothing he won't do to ensure his country's success. If he can, as he said in that last segment I showed you, if we can have a negotiated settlement and we can use, Slovakia or any other venue to do that, we're ready and willing and able to reach a negotiated settlement to end the war at the negotiating table instead of killing more people to do it. But if we don't go down that path, and if Putin actually believes that he has God on his side, it doesn't matter what is real. It only matters what he thinks. And if he acts on that belief there, then there is no path he's not going to go down to ensure his country's survival, meaning he means this. And so we need to keep that in the back of our minds, and Trump does, because you don't want to push too hard on something that he really does have this gut level core belief in, because that's what some people have made decisions that's by others does not make any rational sense. But if he believes that, that's something we need to keep in mind. Well, that's all we have for you today, folks. I appreciate it. We may come back with a special show on Saturday, which is tomorrow. With maybe some kind of a version of an intel brief, which we often do here. I know a lot of people have been, with the holidays and some had a lot of chance to watch a lot of these or watch our podcasts or listen to them. So we're going to have one to kind of wrap it up tomorrow. And as a reminder, wherever you get Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find our podcast there eagerly waiting for your ears. But we thank you. I hope you had a great Christmas. Look forward to getting back together with you in the new year. And in the meantime, have a great day, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.